It started as a joke, a way to kill time after detention. 5 teenagers found themselves in the basement of their school, an old building with dark corners and a history of unexplained oddities. The place had an eerie charm, a maze of crumbling walls, unused rooms and dusty relics from decades past. As they moved through the dim corridors, they stumbled upon a hidden door tucked behind a stack of broken chairs and discarded furniture. It was heavy, wooden, and swollen with age. Pushing it open revealed a small, forgotten room, lined with shelves that held brittle books and strange artifacts covered in cobwebs. Among the clutter, a peculiar book lay on a table in the center of the room. Its leather cover was cracked, and its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten symbols and bizarre illustrations. The book seemed ancient, perhaps even older than the school itself. Flipping through the pages, they came across what appeared to be instructions for a ritual. There was something darkly fascinating about it, an allure that drew them in. It was only meant to be a harmless scare, a summoning spell to laugh about later. They gathered candles which lay scattered among the clutter and arranged them in the pentagram pattern depicted in the book. The instructions seemed simple enough: light the candles, recite the words and place a small token in the circle, a keepsake from each participant. The tokens were personal items they grabbed from their pockets, a keychain, a pendant, a bracelet, and so on. It was all fun and games to them, just an attempt to make a mundane detention interesting. The air in the room thickened as they lit the last candle. It was as if the temperature dropped several degrees, a chill creeping into the room that made their breath come out in faint puffs. The flame of each candle flickered, then surged upward, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The ritual's final words were spoken, each syllable rolling off their tongues with a guttural cadence that felt foreign and unnatural. It was then, as the last sound echoed through the room, that something seemed to shift. A deep vibration beneath the floor, a pulse in the very foundation of the school. The candles snuffed out all at once, plunging them into darkness. An oppressive silence followed, as though the air itself had been sucked from the room. For a moment there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the suffocating weight of stillness. Then a faint rustling began, like dry leaves scraping across the ground, growing louder with each passing second. They fled the basement, laughing nervously at what they assumed was their imagination running wild, chalking up the experience to a simple prank that had gone just as expected. But as they each went home that night, the unease followed. The next day, the school felt different. The air was stale and heavy, and there was a faint, sour odor that seemed to permeate the halls, impossible to trace. The teenagers began to notice subtle changes, shadows in the corner of their vision, a coldness in the air even on warm days, and a persistent sensation that they were being watched. The first to experience the true terror was Emma. She had been lying in bed that night, half asleep, when she heard the scratching. It started as a faint noise, but soon grew more frantic, more desperate, coming from within her walls. When she finally gathered the courage to turn on the light, she was met with an appalling sight, small, deep gouges torn into the plaster, as if something had clawed its way from the inside. That's when she noticed the faint, crooked figure standing in the darkest corner of her room. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, hollow and black, as if absorbing every shadow around it. Over the next few days, the entity made itself known to each of the others in turn. For Daniel, it manifested in the form of swarming insects. What began as a few moths fluttering near his window grew into an infestation. At night, he woke to the sensation of tiny legs crawling on his skin, his room filled with the incessant buzz of wings. He began finding scratches on his arms and legs, marks from his own frantic attempts to rid himself of the phantom insects. No matter how many times he checked, his room always seemed to hum with life that shouldn't have been there. For Sam, the entity took a different form. His deepest fear was suffocation, and it exploited that mercilessly. It began with small things, a tightness in his chest, a difficulty catching his breath. But soon the sensation grew more intense, as though unseen hands were wrapping around his throat, squeezing the air from his lungs. At night, he would wake up gasping, his vision blurring, his lungs burning for air that seemed just beyond his reach. He could swear he saw a shape in the darkness, looming over his bed, watching as he struggled. Madison's experience was different. She had always feared the dark, the way it seemed to stretch and distort everything familiar into something unknown. Her encounters began subtly, a flickering light here, a shadow moving in ways it shouldn't. But soon, the darkness itself seemed to take on a life of its own. At night, the lights in her house would dim and fade until she was left in complete blackness. In those moments, she would feel an overwhelming dread, as if something ancient and malicious was moving toward her, reaching out with unseen hands from the dark. The final teenager, Chris, had always been terrified of being alone, and the entity preyed on this fear in the cruelest way. It isolated him from his friends, sowing discord and paranoia between them, making them turn on each other. He would receive calls on his phone from numbers that didn't exist, the voice on the other end a raspy whisper that seemed to echo his own thoughts. In his house, objects would be moved, pictures would fall, and doors would creak open by themselves. It was as though someone or something was always just one step behind him. The more they suffered, the more they realized the twisted truth. They had not just summoned an entity. They had awakened something ancient and malevolent. It fed on their fear, thrived on their despair. The book they had found had been sealed away for a reason. It had contained a warning, one they hadn't noticed in their eagerness to entertain themselves. The ritual had not been a simple summoning. It had been a binding, a way to imprison a being that should never have been disturbed. And in their recklessness, they had set it free. As the days wore on, the entity's attacks grew bolder, more aggressive. The manifestations of their fears became almost tangible, as though the entity itself was gaining strength from each encounter. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and their shared experiences began to push them to the brink of madness. Sleep offered no respite, and waking moments were filled with dread. Their surroundings seemed to change subtly. Even the familiar corridors of the school appeared distorted, as if the entity's presence was warping the world itself. In a desperate attempt to stop the horror, the remaining friends returned to the basement. They believed they could reverse the ritual, that somehow they could put the entity back into the prison from which they had foolishly released it. But as they approached the hidden room, they were met with an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The air crackled with a malevolent energy, and the door, once heavy and stubborn, now stood wide open as if inviting them in. The room was no longer the same. The walls seemed to pulsate as though alive, and a foul stench filled the air. The book lay open on the floor, its pages fluttering though no wind blew. The candles they had used before were burned down to nubs, the wax pooling on the ground like coagulated blood. As they attempted to perform the ritual in reverse, a terrible force surged through the room, a final mocking display of the entity's power. The darkness coiled around them, suffocating, binding them to the consequences of their actions. The entity did not intend to be banished again. It had tasted freedom, had fed on their deepest fears, and would not let go. As the last candle sputtered out, leaving the teenagers in absolute darkness, a sense of realization washed over them. This was not just a punishment for their carelessness, but an awakening of something far older than the school, the town, or even themselves. The ritual had not summoned it. It had simply let it out of its ancient prison. And now it was free to stalk others, manifesting their darkest fears, feeding off terror for eternity. The twisted ritual had begun a cycle, one that would never end.